I'm sorry that I'm not able to be with you in Zimbabwe to be a part of the preaching conference, but it is great that we're able to do this online and encourage each other and support each other in the work of teaching and preaching. What I want to do in this session is explain what my process is in preparing a sermon series, and specifically looking at a sermon series on the book of Ezekiel. I've been a pastor now for more than 30 years, and the way that I prepare a sermon series has really evolved over that 30 years. So what I'm sharing with you today is something that's developed over a long period of time. But before we start, I want to say the majority of my preaching is preaching through whole books of the Bible. I would say probably 80% of my preaching is picking a book of the Bible and preaching through it from beginning to end. I think that that's the best way to teach the Bible for a couple of reasons. First, I think the people who wrote the books of the Bible expect us to read the book as a whole. They're not expecting us to just dip in and grab a verse here or a paragraph there. They're expecting that we will understand the book as a whole and understand the message as part of that book. Books of the Bible are not meant to be read or understood as just a collection of little paragraphs. They run from beginning to end. But most importantly, if you are preaching through whole books of the Bible, I think that you're helping the people within your congregation to be able to read the Bible for themselves, to be able to understand what the Bible says. So we're doing the members of our congregation a great service if we can show them how to read through this book of the Bible, how to read it, how to understand it for ourselves, and how to apply it to ourselves. As preachers, the best thing that we can do for the members of our congregation is help them to have confidence in reading the Bible for themselves. Now, there's a PDF file that should have been distributed around that goes with this session. There's a talk outline with the heading Preparing a Sermon Series on Ezekiel, and then there are a few diagrams that I'll be drawing your attention to a little bit later on in this session. Now, this session, as I said, is about my process for preparing a sermon series. I'm not saying that this is exactly how you should do it. I'm not saying that this is the only way to do it. What I want to do is show you how I go about preparing a sermon series. There may be some things in here that help you. There may be some things that may actually change the way that you do things. But it's really just me expressing how I go about doing this. So, on your talk outline there, my first step in all of this is to read through the book of the Bible. And maybe even read through it again. Ezekiel is a big book, 48 chapters, so it'll take you a while to read through that. But if you're preaching on a smaller book of the Bible, like Philippians or Colossians, you could probably read it every day for a few weeks and benefit from every reading of it that you take. My mistake when I first started preaching was that I started not by looking at what the book of the Bible said, but looking at what other people said about that book of the Bible. I can remember when I first got sent to the church that I worked at many years ago, more than 30 years ago, I decided to preach on the book of Amos. I had no idea why I chose Amos, but I thought that would be a good thing to do. I think we must have just done it at Bible college. So I started by not reading Amos, but I started by reading commentaries on Amos and seeing what other Bible commentators had to say about the book of Amos. It would have been far better for me to start by reading Amos, just reading through it and reading through it again. Another helpful thing that I have found is writing down notes while I'm reading through that book of the Bible. I don't know if you're anything like me, but very often when I start reading, I can easily drift off and start thinking about other things that I might need to do or other things that I need to get organised. So taking notes will help me to focus and help me to concentrate while I'm reading through that book of the Bible. Might be simple things like just noting the things that you notice as you read through. What are the things that stand out to you? What do you think the writer is trying to say? Are there themes or ideas that come up repeatedly within the book? You can't help but notice that when you read through a book like Ezekiel. Things like the temple and God's glory are two big themes that run right the way through the book of Ezekiel. And as you read through it, you notice how important those things are. Now, this one may sound a little strange, but point number 3 says, what is the vibe or the feel of the book? Every book of the Bible has some kind of feel to it. You can't remove that from the book. It's not simply an instruction manual without any feeling. The books of the Bible demonstrate some kind of a vibe or a feel. Is the book intense? Is the book lighthearted? Is it bold? Is it gentle? Is it comforting? Is it announcing judgment? Those will all be the things that will create that vibe. Every book has its own feel. And it's important as best you can to try to identify that. Try and think about the feel that stands behind the book. Let me give you a couple of examples. You can't read a book like Galatians, and especially Galatians chapter 3, without hearing how frustrated Paul is by what's happening in the churches in Galatia. You already get a sense of it from the very opening of the book. Normally when Paul opens his book, he'll say, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God. And when the letter formally starts, it'll have something like, we always thank God for you, or we always remember you in our prayers. But that's not what we see in the letter to the Galatians. Paul's opening line after his little brief introduction at the beginning is verse 6. He says this, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. You can't get to Galatians chapter 3 and it seems as though Paul's almost yelling at them by this point. He says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? He's frustrated by what's happening in the church there. And that's the feel of the book. Let me give you another example. If you look at the book of 2 Timothy, it has a very distinct feel. I think 2 Timothy is perhaps the saddest book in the Bible. Paul has been abandoned in his hour of need. He is in prison in Rome. And I think he's fearful that Timothy is about to walk away from the preaching of the gospel. You can't read that book without at least attempting to put yourself into Timothy's shoes as though this letter were to you and you're reading what Paul has to say. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying try to read things into the passage that actually aren't there. I'm not saying that you should look for things that aren't in the passage. What I am saying is that every book of the Bible will have some kind of feel to it. And it can help you in your preaching to try to identify that feel. There's a quote there in your handout from Roy Clements, an English preacher. He says this, any Bible exposition will have failed if it locates the intellectual content of the text, but neglects to communicate the emotional texture in which that content is embedded. Good exposition invites the listener to feel with the text as well as to think about it. So when you're preaching, help people to see the feel of the text. It'll make them better Bible readers if you're able to show them how you can do that. So the next step for me is step number 4, is making sure that we understand the setting for this particular book. Where does it fit into the overall story of the Bible? I've heard too many preachers who approach the Bible flatly, as though it's just some collection of stories that's all been thrown together and you can dig in here or dig in there and pull out whatever story and give people some moral life lesson or some principles that they can live by. Now, I know that you're very aware of this, but the Bible has a continuous story that starts in the book of Genesis and culminates in the book of Revelation. So if you're looking at the book of Ezekiel, you need to understand where this fits in the overall story of the Bible. And you also need to think about who is this book written for. So with the book of Ezekiel, God's people, Judah, have been dragged off into captivity in Babylon. And they are there because of their repeated unfaithfulness in their relationship with God. The northern part of the kingdom, Israel, well, that disappeared more than 100 years ago when the Assyrians came in and took control. Judah, the southern part of the kingdom, has now been taken off into Babylon, into captivity in Babylon, again because of their repeated unfaithfulness. And this is, without a doubt, the lowest point in their history. And as this book of Ezekiel opens up, the situation must have seemed completely and utterly hopeless. Ezekiel, who's now 30 years of age and should be starting work as a priest in the temple in Jerusalem, but he's not in Jerusalem. He's sitting beside an irrigation ditch in Babylon. Ezekiel's job will be to show God's people where they went wrong, to help them to understand the seriousness of their unfaithfulness in their relationship with God. So the first half of the book of Ezekiel is very dark. There is a message of judgment that is repeated over and over again, an explanation of their unfaithfulness, acted out, presented as a prophecy by Ezekiel. So let me say it again. You need to remember that there is a story that runs the whole way through the Bible, a story that starts in the book of Genesis and finishes in the book of Revelation. And you need to remember where Ezekiel fits in that. Remember where you are up to in the story. And another important thing to remember that we stand on this side of the cross. So don't make the mistake of thinking that the book of Ezekiel is somehow about us. It's not. It's about the people of Judah and them being sent off into captivity because of their unfaithfulness. It's about God's people at a very specific moment in their history. We can learn from their experience, but we stand on this side of the cross. And we know that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. I've heard people preach through books like Ezekiel and taken judgment ideas that are presented in Ezekiel and trying to throw it at their congregation and pronounce judgment on them. That's not how we're to understand the book of Ezekiel. We need to remember who we are, and we need to remember who that book was written to. And we are people who stand uncondemned because of what God has done for us through his Son, Jesus. So let me quickly recap. My process, the first 4 steps will be this. To start by reading the book. Read through the book of Ezekiel. And while you're reading through the book, make some notes, jot down things, have your computer open and type down things that you notice, questions that you may have, things that you don't understand, themes or ideas or words that keep getting repeated. Note those down. Maybe there's a reason that word comes up so regularly. So I'm reading it, I'm taking notes, and while I'm taking notes, I'm trying to think about the vibe of the book. And my next step is that I want to make sure that I can see the structure of the book as well. So my next task is that trying to think through, is the material organised in a particular way? Is there a structure to what's happening here? Are there logical units that Ezekiel takes us through as this book is put together? If you can see the structure, then it'll help you to understand why the material has been arranged the way that it has. It'll help you to understand what the significance or what the meaning of the passages is going to be. So the structure of the book, Ezekiel has arranged his material in a particular way. How does this book break up? Does it break up easily? Can I see the structure? as I work through this, can I see how it is that Ezekiel has done this? I mention this because I had a friend who was preaching through the book of Revelation at the same time that I was. And I asked him, how are you approaching Revelation? How have you broken it up? And he said, oh, simple. I'm just doing half a chapter every week. Now, that would be a 44-week sermon series where I don't think anyone's going to end up understanding the overall message of the book of Revelation. That's not how the book is meant to be understood. You can't just break it up into half a chapter. I mean, imagine breaking up chapter 4 into 2 sermons or chapter 5 into 2 sermons. These 2 chapters hang together. They're about the throne of God and God sitting on the throne and the Lamb sitting on the throne together. You can't understand it by simply breaking it up into half chapters here and there. You need to see the logical units that are there. And it's very clear in a book like Revelation, and reasonably clear in the book of Ezekiel as well. Now, once I have some idea of what I think the structure of the book might be, that's when I will look at how other people have broken it up. Diagram number 1 that looks like this. That has a series of columns from Bible commentators or Bible study books, and looking at how they have broken up the book. Again, they're doing it for different reasons. Tim Chester has a series of Bible studies. Chris Wright has written a Bible commentary, the Bible Speaks Today series, as has Derek Thomas in the Welwyn series. Bryson Smith on the end is a friend of mine here in Australia, and this was how he preached through it. And the final column is my breakup, how I decided I was going to work through this book of the Bible. So each of those little boxes represents one sermon in the series. When I preached through Ezekiel, I took 6 weeks to do it. Now, 48 chapters over 6 weeks, that might seem like I was racing through it, but I think it took seriously the structure of the book of Ezekiel. Now, that may be a lot of chapters to cover in each sermon, but I think that the material has been put together that way by Ezekiel. Chapters 1 to 3 offer us this introduction to the book of Ezekiel. God's people are in captivity because of their repeated unfaithfulness. Ezekiel has just turned 30, should be starting work as a priest in Jerusalem, but he's been given this incredible vision, and he's been commissioned to preach to God's people, to preach to the people who are in captivity. Chapters 4 to 24 is an explanation of why God's judgment has come on his people. It's that repeated unfaithfulness and God announcing that his judgment is coming on them because of their unfaithfulness. Chapters 25 to 32 are quite interesting within the structure of the book, because rather than talking about judgment on God's people, it's talking about judgment on all of the nations around God's people. Chapters 33 to 36, the tone of the book begins to change. No longer just judgment, but God is promising that he's going to do something about their unfaithfulness and the unfaithfulness of their leaders. In fact, God says that he will come to lead his people. Chapters 37 to 39 talks about the new life with the valley of the dry bones. And then chapters 40 to 48, we have this incredible vision of the temple restored. But remember, this is about Jesus. Jesus is the one who is God present with his people. So we need to understand the structure of the book and see if we can break it up into those logical units and preach through those logical units. Diagram number 2 in your PDF handout, the diagram that looks like this. Underneath the line, I've put in the significant events that we see in the book of Ezekiel. We see that they have started in exile, that God's glory is revealed to Ezekiel as he sits by this irrigation ditch. Then in chapter 8, we see that God's glory departs from the temple in Jerusalem. Then a little further on in chapter 18, we hear that in chapter 24, we hear that Jerusalem has been surrounded. And then in chapter 32, we hear that Jerusalem has fallen. And it's just at that point where things seem as though they couldn't possibly be any worse. The temple has been destroyed, Jerusalem has been overrun, the people are living in captivity. It's at that point, when the news is at its absolute worst, that God begins to make promises about restoring, about sending leaders, being the one who will lead his people, giving life to the lifeless in the valley of dry bones, and ultimately this vision of the temple on which the book of Ezekiel closes. Now, another helpful resource that I know that you have, last year we gave out some flash drives that have the Bible Project videos. The Bible Project also provide posters. You've got that in your handout. That shows you a slightly more detailed structure, but very similar structure to the one that I have used in preaching through the book of Ezekiel. So it takes you through and shows you how the material has been put together by Ezekiel, how it's been presented in his book. That can be a helpful thing to do, to have a look through those Bible Project videos and see how it is that they have broken up the book, what structure they have given to it. Now, the last thing that I want to do, once I've decided how I'm going to break up this book for preaching, I want to try and think about the big idea and the application for each of the talks. Now, the reason for this is because I want to make sure that I actually balance out my preaching through the book of Ezekiel. A book that deals so much with judgment, it could be a dark message that gets repeated every week. But I didn't want to do that. I also want to make sure that my practical application is placed in the right sermon. I want to think about how to practically apply a book like the book of Ezekiel to the members of the congregation that I'm preaching to, and think about how they might live in response to what God's word says. I don't want the big idea of my talk one week and then realise that 2 weeks later that would have been a really good big idea to have for that talk. And I don't want to make my practical application in one talk when later on it may have been way better to make the practical application for a sermon later in the series. So what I try to do is I try to think about the whole sermon series. Now, this is where diagram 4 comes in. It's the diagram that looks like this. It's simply an Excel spreadsheet where I've tried to put the big idea or the key idea of the talk in the first column. And then in the fourth column, you'll see that there's an attempt to come up with some application for each of the talks as well. Now, I didn't fill all of the boxes in. It was just helping me to think a little bit more carefully about how to balance the whole sermon series over those 6 talks. I have to confess, I don't do this every time. It would probably be a helpful thing for me to do every time I prepare a sermon series, but I have done it, and I've done it particularly when I've been looking at those more difficult books. So I've done it when I've preached through Ezekiel, when I preached through Zechariah, and when I preached through the book of Revelation. I wanted to make sure that I was giving a balanced view right the way through the book and spreading the application and the big idea in the most appropriate way. Now, you may be thinking that all of this sounds like a lot of work, and you're probably right. It does involve a lot of work. But in the end, it will make writing each of the talks a lot easier when it gets around to preparing each sermon each week, because I've already done a lot of the hard work beforehand. I've spent time in preparing the sermons beforehand. And again, my fear is that in my earlier days as a preacher, without trying to think of the whole book, I would preach on a passage, make the application and the big ideas of that passage come to life as we preach through it. Then I would get to the next passage and I would realize, oh, it would have been much better to use that illustration here or to talk about that subject here. And understanding the whole book means that I can actually balance those things out, that I can actually share the load right across the whole sermon series. And the preparation that I do before the sermon series has even started pays off because I spend less time writing each individual sermon as the sermon series is being preached. And it's good to have that overall understanding of the book so that each sermon that I prepare is done in light of that overall message of the book. Well, I hope that that's been a helpful thing. Again, let me stress, this is what I have developed over a long period of time, more than 30 years of being a preacher now. I'm not saying this is exactly how you should do it. Maybe there's one or two things that you can glean from this that might be helpful for you. But this is simply me explaining my process for preparing a sermon series. If you have any questions or any comments that you'd like to make, then we'll be putting those through the WhatsApp chat group. So I'm happy to give you any answers that I can to things that might not have been clear or that I could perhaps explain a little better. But thanks for listening. Hope to catch you in Zimbabwe sometime next year.